Did you know there are no late fines on overdue materials at QPL? We want to make sure everyone can use the library's resources, no matter their circumstances. For more details on QPL's elimination of late fines, visit queenslib.org/goodbye late fines. School is in session and we have free help for homework. BrainFuse Help Now offers homework help, online tutoring, and more school support for kids in grades K-12 daily from 2 to 11 p.m. A library card and Wi-Fi connection are all that your child needs in order to participate. Visit queenslib.org/brainfuse to get started. The next election takes place on November 8th, and early voting starts on October 29th. Visit our blog for more important dates, voting FAQs, voting plans, and voter resources.
Welcome to Queens Public Library's talk with Richard Barone, author of Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 1960s, and legendary music journalist Anthony de Curtis, who wrote the introduction for Barone's book. Of Music and Revolution, the Scottish musician Donovan says, as you wander through Richard Barone's excellent telling of the astounding events that took place in Greenwich Village from 1960 to 1969, remember that each folk and blues singer you meet, the unknown and the well-known, all fell under the spell of a very small community, which still retains to this day its village dimensions. Breathe in the atmosphere of where it all began. Stephen Petrus, co-author of Folk City, New York and the American Folk Music Revival, states, Greenwich Village is not only the stomping ground of songwriter Richard Barone, but also his creative muse. His account, Music and Revolution, on the village folk scene in the 1960s is a lovely companion to his album Sorrows and Promises, providing us sketches of memorable characters and giving us insight into the sights and sounds of the famed Manhattan neighborhood. Hi, I'm Brian Alessandro. For those of you who don't know me, I have written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Penk, Huffington Post, and I recently adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions' Penguin Random House, which will be released this December. Additionally, I co-edited Fever Spores, The Queer Reclamation of William S. Burroughs, an anthology of essays and interviews about Burroughs for Rebel Satori Press. I'm also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the literary journal, The New Engagement. My first novel, The Unmentionable Mon, was published in 2015 by Cairn Press, and my first feature film, Afghan Hound, was produced by Marrier Media in 2011. It is now streaming on Plex, Tubi, and Amazon. My new novel, Performer Non Grata, will be released in April 2023 by Rebel Satori Press. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 9th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. Richard Barone is a recording artist, performer, producer, professor, and author. Since pioneering the indie rock scene in Hoboken, New Jersey as frontman of the Bongos, Barone has worked with artists in every musical genre, including Donovan, Lou Reed, and folk legend Pete Seeger. He has produced concert events at Carnegie Hall, the Hollywood Bowl, and Summer Stage in Central Park. His album, Sorrows and Promises, is a celebration of the 1960s music scene in Greenwich Village, where Barone lives. He currently teaches the course, Music and Revolution, at the New School of Jazz and Contemporary Music, serves on the advisory board of Anthology Film Archives, and has served on the board of governors of the Recording Academy, the Grammys, and hosts folk radio on WBAI New York. Anthony de Curtis is an American author and music critic who has written for Rolling Stone, the New York Times, Relics, and many other publications. De Curtis has been a contributing editor at Rolling Stone for more than 30 years. He holds a PhD in American literature from Indiana University and is a distinguished lecturer in the creative writing program at the University of Pennsylvania. He collaborated with Clive Davis on Davis's autobiography, The Soundtrack of My Life, which was published by Simon & Schuster. He appears in Clive Davis, The Soundtrack of Our Lives, a documentary that opened the Tribeca Film Festival in 2017. His biography of Lou Reed, titled Lou Reed, A Life, was published by Little Brown. He has served as a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominating committee for more than 20 years. In 1996, he served as a moderator on the VH1 show Four on the Floor and as editorial director for the channel's nonfiction programming. You've seen him on MTV, VH1, The Today Show. I can go on. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Richard and Anthony.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having us.
My pleasure. So Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 1960s, Richard, was first a course that you created and taught at the New School of Jazz and Contemporary Music. When did you create the course and what compelled you to translate it into a book?
Well, it was really making that album that you referenced, Sorrows and Promises, around 2015 and 2016. When I knew that there was, I've always known there was something special about the Greenwich Village music scene of the 60s, but of course I wasn't actually here at that time. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Florida, mm-hmm. and that was Greenwich Village was a distant dream, you know. Mm-hmm. But I love the idea of it, and then I moved here at the suggestion of Tiny Tim, soon after high school, and I loved the village, but I wasn't here much because I was always on tour. It's when I kind of came down for a landing and really just spent time in the village. The stories just were coming out of the buildings at me for years. When Mitchell Cohen, the writer and also former A&R director of various record labels, Columbia, Verve, suggested to me that I do an album of songs for Greenwich Village in the 60s. At first, I thought he meant like a various artist collection, and I do produce records, and I thought he meant, you know, gather some singers and find the songs. But he was thinking of me to do all the songs, and that got me into a deep dive because to really sing them, I wanted to know the stories of the people who wrote them.
Sure. And to that point, in your book, you do write about Tiny Tim bringing you to the village. You also write about Donovan encouraging you to write about the ones no one has ever heard of.
Right.
Which I thought was really poignant.
It's true. That's where the story really was for me. People like the guitar player like Barry Kornfeld or Dylan's first manager, Terry Thal. These people had such great and in-depth stories to me that weren't really framed or edited in any kind of, a public relations way. They were just the real deal.
Organic.
Organic.
Yeah, on some level. Yeah. And so, Anthony, of course, you wrote the introduction to Richard's wonderful book. Speak to me a little bit about that, about your thoughts on his, really thoughtful research that we spoke about before.
Without question. Yeah. Well, Richard and I have been friends for many, many years, I'm proud to say. I mean, I started out as a fan of the Bongos, interviewed Richard when the Bongos came. I was living in Atlanta in the early 80s, and the Bongos came through there to play at a club called 688, and interviewed Richard when they did that. And when I moved back to New York in 1984, and not too long after that, we became, we fell into each other's circles. And Richard is one of the people who if somebody were doing a book about music in Greenwich Village today, I mean, Richard would have to be a big part of it, or music in New York generally.
Sure.
He's somebody who keeps it moving, somebody who with his own projects with other people, for other people, moves, to the foreground, to the background. Is quite an extraordinary person. And, I admire him a great deal, and just completely just proud again of our friendship. So partly for all that, I think Richard asked me if I would write an introduction. I also grew up in Greenwich Village.
Right.
So I was there, during the years that Richard describes. My parents, Italian working class people, they weren't bohemian hipsters. But, I grew up right on the corner of 10th Street and Bleecker, so I was right in the heart of it.
Oh.
And, hearing, as soon as I began getting interested in music and in, the counterculture, as we referred to it back then, all of these stories, um, you know, began, drifting into my brain. And Richard, at first, Richard asked me to write the introduction. I thought, great, that'll be delightful. I know Richard primarily. I mean, though Richard has written another really great book called Frontman. I know
Mhm.
him primarily as a musician, and so I thought, well, this will be, a kind of musician's take on, what all that was, and I'll be happy to read it. I'd be excited about it. But it turned out to be that and so much more. I mean, Richard did a beautiful job of, it's one of these great books that's extremely well researched, but
Oh, yeah,
but
tremendously.
um, but isn't like weighed down by its research. Richard just cruises through through these stories, and there are the great anecdotes, great historical information, great musical analysis, and it all as if you were sitting there talking with him. So it was a delight to read and a great pleasure to write the introduction. I was very excited about it.
And I think I told the two of you during our AV test earlier in the week that when I first read it, I had something like 57 questions that I wanted to share with the two of you, but that would be like a 3-hour program. So I had to edit my questions because it's so full, it's so robust. And I would love to kind of go through, every musician that you write about, these beautiful little kind of mini bios, Richard.
Yeah.
But we can't do that. So can we maybe just sort of go through those who were first on the scene and who had the greatest impact? Of course, there was Pete Seeger. There was David Van Ronk, was an inspiration, is referred to as the so-called mayor of McDougal Street. Who were some other names who were sort of integral to the moment and to the movement?
I really think that Paul Clayton, who's never spoken about, was important because he was a young folk, like a prodigy, who had his own radio show in high school and college, who really went into the fields and found the true folk music and brought it back to New York.
Mhm.
And then it was, what is the word, decimated? It was like, it was used by so many artists, especially Bob Dylan.
Mhm.
But he brought such raw material, like almost like a mini sort of Alan Lomax, and younger Alan Lomax coming into the late 50s into the Village, and I think had a lot of impact that people don't realize. I wanted to make sure that he's covered in the book. And his relationship with Bob Dylan was a unique one, and one that led to a lot of familiar songs that we know so well, but they came from Paul Clayton bringing songs to Bob.
And I think there's some of the obvious icons like Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Buffy
Yes.
St. Marie, Woody Guthrie, Tiny Tim. But then there are some surprises too that maybe the average music enthusiast wouldn't necessarily place in the
Yeah.
folk music scene of the 60s, like Dion DiMucci or Harry
Right.
Belafonte.
Yeah,
who-
but Dion he wanted to be a folk singer. It's hard for him to kind of get out of his teen idol kind of role, but he loved it and wanted to be that.
Dion and the Belmonts, of course,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So-
exactly.
and then Paul Clayton, and who else? There were Peter, Paul, and Mary. You write about Phil
Right.
Oakes.
There's so many bands and there's so many artists, and I love how they drift into town at different times. It really becomes like a growing cast of characters. When I was writing the book, it was a thrill to kind of, as I was researching, who's going to move in next or who's coming next. And I tried to keep it as chronological as I could so you can get a flow, like when Eric Anderson comes. And, by that point, like it's evolving, like the music is changing in subtle ways throughout the story.
And maybe Anthony, you could speak to this as well, but I think Richard does a good job of storytelling in
Yeah.
that as you're reading it, it almost feels like a novel based on true life events. You're like, oh, when are the Mamas and the Papas or Simon and Garfunkel or Joni Mitchell going to pop in? And, eventually they do make their appearance.
Yeah.
Maybe speak to that a little bit too.
Yeah,
about
sure.
Richard's ability to tell
The
a
other-
story.
but I think you touched on a really good point that, Greenwich Village is well-trod territory, but Richard brings a real fresh touch to it, and I think one of the ways that he does that is by introducing characters like Dion, for whom, that really did become an important scene.
Mhm.
He was looking for some new directions. Buddy Holly is another character, moved to the Village. I think very rightly, Richard counts, Lou Reed as somebody that is, part of this world. So it isn't, it's musically very expansive,
Mhm.
Richard's approach.
Oh, I think so.
And that, you know, um, that draws really nice connections between, what these various artists are doing. I mean, you know, Eric Anderson uh, and Lou Reed became friends, and they would joke with each other like, "Well, we were in the same place. We were just riding different subway lines." And
Right.
that was kind of what it was like.
Mhm.
There was the village, as again Richard makes clear, was a place that had always welcomed that kind of that kind of diversity, the ability to bring your newness, bring your approach,
Yeah.
recreate yourself, become who you want to be. And so that Richard weaves all that together, I think, very skillfully. It's not
Oh,
easy to do.
no, it's not, and you do it skillfully, Richard. You mentioned Alan Lomax. For people who don't know who John and Alan Lomax were, can you talk to us about them and also what they contributed to the culture?
Yes, of course. I think Alan Lomax considered himself a song catcher. Like he was looking for material, looking for songs, where the origins of songs. And he and his father, John Lomax, were hired by the Library of Congress to travel through different regions of the United States, especially the South, to
Mhm.
find regional musics. And they did, and they collected thousands and thousands of recordings that are now available through the Library of Congress website. But those songs, Pete Seeger was their assistant, and he would bring the songs into the folk community to become the material that the folk singers were singing. Alan Lomax was also a young folk singer at the time. So they were bringing the songs into the culture.
Another thing I have to really credit you with is being quite blunt about who some of these people really were. You when you write about the Lomaxes discovering in 1933 Huddie Ledbetter, it's and how perhaps there was a discussion about how they exoticized black recording artists. You don't shy away from that conversation. And George Harrison even famously said, "No Lead Belly, no Beatles." Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of the tone of that when I explore, like, is it exploitation? Things
Mhm.
like that
Yeah.
a lot of that comes from my students because they would ask me, Professor, why is Leadbelly driving now for the Lomaxes?
Mm.
There are things like that. On the other hand, he was out of prison. So like there's such a give and take that was going on. And I try to be fair to everyone in the book in that when I describe that situation, it's heavy, it's complicated, very
It's heavy,
complicated.
but it's also very much of this sort of moment where we need to have these dissections and these conversations about history and about art and reappraise them on some level. And you do
Yeah.
a good job of that. It's very responsible, I think, of you.
Thank you. Thank
Um,
you.
and to this point too, many folk musicians identified as communists before the word
Yeah.
became weaponized.
Right.
Virtuous. It was virtuous, and it was
Well, it was pretty weaponized back then as well.
sure,
Yeah, yeah,
sure,
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the idea is it was concerned with civil rights at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And maybe speak to us a little bit about that, and we'll get to that overlap in a moment too. When Martin Luther King calls on Pete Seeger and Joan Baez and others uh, for the movement. Can we,
Well, Pete Seeger, I became friends with him toward the last several years of his life, and he would call me in the evenings around 5 or 6, and we have a chat. And one day he called me, and I was walking in the village somewhere, and he said, "Richard, I want to explain to you why I was a communist." And I was kind of taken aback. I went to a quiet spot on the street where I could speak quietly. I said, "Well, Pete, you don't have to tell me. You don't have to explain to me anything, you know." And he said, "Well, I want to explain to you. We were anti-fascist.
right,
We were fighting Hitler," is what he told me when he was
right,
at Harvard. And I mean, that was a part of it. The idea that the communist, the youth, whatever the communist youth group, whatever the title of it is, communist youth party, they were against Hitler during a time when people were on the fence.
right,
They were decidedly anti-fascism. So that's one
right.
thing that Pete told me.
And
And they were also pro-labor. The pro-labor aspect was
right,
very, that's really
Well,
that's
right,
this is extremely important. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
just to quickly interject.
yes, please.
Uh, in the 30s, the Great Depression,
Mhm.
when we talk about, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and all that stuff, that was in large part an effort to take the edge off the kind of revolutionary impulses that were
Mm.
being felt. There
Mhm.
was no Social Security
Yeah,
back then.
right,
There was no safety net for people, and people were starving, and so all of the components of what would make a revolutionary movement were here, and Roosevelt created a series of programs that were meant to sort of address that. And so the communists were the people who were like essentially bringing a lot of that stuff forward.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And obviously later it became problematic with Stalin. I mean,
Right.
Right. Yeah. He
which,
ended up giving him all a bad name.
He was horrified
Right.
by what the Soviet Union became.
Sure. And well, I think that Richard does such a elegant job of sort of weaving back and forth between music and politics, because the book is music and revolution. So it's one half of the story you're telling. I just co-edited an anthology about William S. Burroughs, and you write about the Beats a bit. And how did the Beats influence folk music in the 60s?
It's so profound, I think, because I think the lyrical style that many of them, not all of them, but many of them were inspired by, many of the songwriters were the Beats. And it's especially seen, I think, in Bob Dylan's work, but it's also Richard Farina and others. The lyrics read like beat poetry.
Oh yeah, I think so.
And I think that opened up a way of wordplay and imagery that would not have been in songs if it was not for the Beats. They, as you know, in the book, I really give them a lot of credit. I work with David Amram. We're going to be doing a performance at the Museum of the City of New York next week on Thursday, the 13th. And David Amram will be there performing some of his songs that he wrote with Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg.
Wow, that's incredible. Anthony, in the introduction, you write that Greenwich Village earned a reputation early on as a place where real music could be played, a magnet for rock stars, artist renewal, allowing their music to be about doing interesting things and not just having hits. Can you extrapolate a little bit on that?
Yeah. I think, Greenwich Village was, a home for alternative culture. I mean, one thing I really remember, when I was growing up as a kid there, a block from Christopher Street was, the gay community. I mean, that word didn't really exist.
Sure.
But I never did not know what a gay person was.
Right.
That was just something that was always, part of the community there.
Sure.
And that was just, one sort of thread through, but like, culturally, theater, painting, all of these things were fermenting in Greenwich Village. And so, folk musicians, sort of picked up on a lot of that. And there was a kind of sense of, I did an interview one time with Bobby Newirth, who, died, unfortunately, I guess within the last year. And, he was Dylan's good friend and somebody who had almost like a Zelig-like quality in the 60s, being at every important situation and having a hand in it. But I remember talking to him about the 60s, and he goes, well, the thing that we say now about a record or an artist is, how are they doing? How are they selling?
Yeah.
Because, we never thought about that back then. It was always, does he have something to say?
Right.
I went to see this jazz musician the other night. Oh, does he have something to say? And that is what the Village, represented. Even in terms of the pop music, I used to see, John Sebastian strolling around all the time, and you think about a band like the Lovin' Spoonful sort of coming out of that world. These were not, there's not that there's anything wrong with just people who are hit makers. But if Dion is looking for a new direction, he's going to go down to the Village,
Right.
And he's going to be listening to those characters, and seeing what he can find out, and that's the spirit of the place, and that's what Richard summons that spirit in his book.
Thank you.
Yeah. Something that you write about that I think would be useful for our viewers to help understand, Richard, is the differentiation between folk, bluegrass, blues, and country. Sometimes those lines blur. Can Can you, for the audience, kind of articulate briefly the, the differences?
Oh, they
between
really
the-
blur. They blur. All of the genres blur because even jazz blurs into that too.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's why I use, the location of Washington Square Park, Washington Square Park in the middle of the village, as a musical centerpiece for the book. It's because it seems like there was a corner for all of these genres, but in the middle you would hear all of them. So a blues, you would hear blues that would sort of go the mix very well with country and bluegrass and folk and jazz, and that's why the singer-songwriter movement and what really came out of the original folk revival that we're talking about, was a mix of all these genres. Really, I mean, Tim Hardin had so many jazz elements in his music, but it was still kind of folk, and it's impossible for me to separate the genres. They blurred in the Village, especially tremendously, I think.
Anthony, did you want to say anything to that?
Oh, just endorse everything that Richard just said, but also, like the way that shows were booked.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Dylan would be opening for John Lee Hooker or somebody,
Yeah.
And there was these kind of open ears, I guess is the way to think of it.
Yes.
Everybody was listening to things, and that sense of the way that people become so defensive about genres sometimes. That was not really something that was true here.
It was like anti-binary before it became a thing.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Also, on those bills that Anthony was referring to, also would be often a spoken word artist, a poet or comedian. So that was, again, that ended up in the music too. The idea of like we said, the Beat Poets influence is because they were sharing bills with the artists too.
Right. And I remember Burroughs with The Saint They Called Him in the 90s. Cobain did that with him, sort of like as a kind of a throwback, I think, to that time when writers and artists, musicians would work together on a song or an album.
Sure.
What is it, do you think? We've spoken a bit about, the Village as being this magnet, but what do you think culturally and even geographically made the Village such a magnet for community and music and revolution in the 60s? Anthony, you mentioned, it was truly a village where everybody knew everybody. Can you speak a little bit about that? What was it about the makeup of this place that had this magic?
Wow. I think that, it was very interesting. I mean, the world that I grew up in, I often joke that, in a certain way, I grew up right in the heart of Greenwich Village, but I might as well have grown up in a kind of Neapolitan hill town. It was plenty of people around me spoke Italian, and there were all the little shops and all that stuff. So, the neighborhood was kind of rooted, it wasn't kind of a transient place. The Village was also very cheap. In a way that's really almost heartbreaking to explain to young people these days.
God, I know.
I remember a friend of mine, this is probably more like maybe 1970 or 71, got an apartment in Brooklyn Heights, and he was paying like $110. Oh no, he was paying $90 for an apartment in Brooklyn Heights. And I said, God, why are you going to Brooklyn Heights? Like, for $110, you can get an apartment around here, like that was absolutely true. And so it was very inexpensive. And, from the beginning, and, maybe even beforehand, but certainly from the beginning of the 20th century, the Village was, it's kind of a unique place in the city. It's, the grid is complicated. You really have to learn it. And there were, aspects of it that, it wasn't obviously downtown, the business district. It wasn't midtown and, that kind of corporate district. It wasn't uptown, which was, like a little bit wealthier. It had that bohemian thing. It really kind of seemed welcoming to people who, weren't coming to do the ordinary, weren't on any kind of ordinary path.
Do you think it's retained a lot of that, or have you, you're in an advantage where you've seen this incredible transformation through the decades from childhood to 2022. Has it retained much of that, do you think?
Do I think?
Yeah.
No, unfortunately. I
Yeah.
mean, at some of it, of course, I mean, for me, when I go down there, I'm in an almost dream space, to be honest. I mean, Richard's block, you mentioned, the Pope of Greenwich Village, whose name is escaping me right this second.
Dave Van Ronk.
Dave Van Ronk.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, Dave really lived like 2 blocks from where Richard is,
Mhm.
on Waverly Place.
Right.
You know, I did a story one time on, Bob Dylan's girlfriend, Susie Rotolo,
Solo, yeah.
and she told me like the newsstand at Sheridan Square, where I used to get the newspaper or magazines. I used to go get Rave magazine when I was a kid, the rock and roll stuff from England. That's where she and Bob went to get an early edition of the New York Times when Robert Shelton wrote the review of Bob Dylan's show.
Hmm.
They lived right down the street on West 4th Street. The places are still there, and there are hints of it. If you know about it, you can sense them and feel it. But man, it's like
Well,
most parts become very expensive, and like when I see like what used to be like old
Yeah.
grocery stores with like one fancy dress hanging on a rack, it's just like wow.
absurd.
this place
I
is-
know. I mean, even just since the 90s, when I was a kid, I've seen a great transformation just in these past 25 years or so. What were some of the hot spots in the village where these musicians would perform or even just hang out? And what are the ones that have endured?
Are you asking me?
This is to both of you.
Oh.
Sure.
Well, I would want to say too that a lot of the venues were so like, just small basement spaces that became venues. Like the Grasslight really was a coal cellar that had been transformed into a poetry club, and then finally had music. It was a natural evolution that how the venues developed, I think. The first real venue, as they say, real meaning that you could actually get paid for playing there and they charge admission, was Folk City, I believe, Gertie's Folk City. But there were before that in the late 50s. That was 1960. And before that, there was the Gaslight, there was the Fat Black Pussycat, I think, was there. There were certain venues. I don't think really very many of them are still running. Cafe Wa, of course, still is open and still has shows, and I'm on their email list, and they have shows every night. And the Bitter End, but they came up in the early 60s, I would say. Very late 50s, end of the 50s.
And I should say also, these places, there was no, I mean, whatever the age limit was or the drinking limit was, I could get into any club that I wanted to go to from when I was 15 years old. I don't ever one time ever remember being questioned.
Wow.
You just go in and, maybe, I mean, I wasn't drinking, I was there for the music. So I would, order, I don't know, whatever I would order, coffee or a soda or something. But, maybe that would have created problems for me. But, it was a pretty wide open scene. If you were into it, you could get in to see anything. And, and it wasn't that expensive again, really for a couple of bucks. You'd be in a tiny, tiny place to see some amazing artists.
And you were mentioning, getting in there underage, because Susie Rotolo was only 17 at first.
Yep.
And another woman, Barbara Rubin, was only 16 or so, and she was going to all the clubs, and it eventually brought the Velvet Underground to Andy Warhol. I mean, there was these teenagers that were part of this. It was a very young scene.
Yeah. Speaking about young, Joan Baez rejected an offer, and I'm shifting gears a bit, rejected an offer in 1960 from Columbia Records and then signed with Vanguard, an independent label, which represented a wide range of mistrust, I think, of the larger labels. And it's a trend that would reappear in the early 90s with indie rock and alternative.
In the 80s, actually, in the 80s. For sure, yeah.
So it's sort of can you speak a little bit about that and sort of the trend that ended up lasting decades by making that gesture? And she was very young at the time, too.
Yeah, but there were a lot of indie labels around. Columbia was really looking to cash in. I don't mean that in a negative way. I love Columbia Records. They're a great label. But, they were looking to have a folk singer, and they were looking to sign a female folk singer, and Joan Baez was their choice. And when she rejected them, because she did prefer the low-key vibe at Vanguard on 14th Street, in some, I'm sure very small office, whatever. She liked that and related to that better. That's when they signed Carolyn Hester to Columbia, because they wanted to sign a folk singer. That's how labels, major labels often work that way. They're looking for a certain thing. I would say they're looking for a certain type of act that they want to make sure their roster has whatever it needs. And they did well with Carolyn Hester because her harmonica player was Bob Dylan, and they signed him on the spot. So
Wow.
What
again, shifting gears, you write a bit about the riots and the police brutality in Washington Square Park during the period. Can you say a little bit about that? And maybe, Anthony, if you can also shed some light on that unrest during that period.
Well, they had been playing folk music in the park for a couple of decades already. That started in the 1940s. People would gather around that fountain, and often it was the protest songs of that era. It was the as we said, the left wing folk scene. So that had been going on for decades. But in the early 60s, there was a movement to stop the music in the park for many reasons. A noise level, maybe too many people, maybe they didn't like the look of the people that were playing music there. But there was a definite movement to stop it. It was supported by the New York Times and other publications also. And the problem was that the problem for the musicians is they stopped giving the license or whatever it was, the permit to play music in the park. They just stopped giving it out suddenly. And there was Izzy Young, who ran the Folklore Center, a hangout of many of these musicians, including Bob Dylan, decided to protest, to organize a protest and have all the singers go there and play music in the park in protest, which they did. And it caused what looks to me on the film Sunday, which you can find on YouTube by Dan Drazen, looks to me like it actually does turn into a riot, but it seems incited by the police in many ways, They're pushing around folk singers who are gentle boys with auto harps, and their ukuleles are being pushed around and assaulted, and
Not a good look.
we want to see your identification, and he pulls out his draft card. The draft card isn't good enough, so it's like he gets arrested. It's in the film. It's a fantastic film. Dan Drazen, who made the film, was only 18 at the time.
Wow. You mentioned, Richard, a second ago, you mentioned protest song. You also write about persuasion songs and propaganda songs in your book. Can you differentiate those for us?
I didn't know the difference. I was looking up somebody had written about one of my own songs, which is called, I wrote for the Occupy Wall Street movement several years ago, a song called Hey, Can I Sleep on Your Futon? And someone did their thesis on that song, and in it describes the different types of protest music. There's a chart in the book, and I don't have it. I could probably find it. But yeah, it's, persuasion song solicit and arouses outside support and sympathy. Propaganda song points to some problem or discontent in the society, usually in emotional terms. And the protest song invokes solutions.
That's great.
See what I mean? So those are three, and I tried to break it down a bit. And then most of the songs that we talk about in the book are one of those. Most of the songs that we call topical songs are usually one of those three. Or of course with the gray space in between.
So Richard, your book contains a lot of really wonderful photographs, and your publisher Backbeat sent a few to us. So if we can just get that slideshow up, and maybe you can discuss some of the images as we go through them.
Yeah, that's Richie Havens backstage at the Woody Guthrie Memorial Concert. Right when Woody passed, they did a show at Carnegie Hall. That's in the dressing room at Carnegie Hall, 1968. That's Richie Havens.
Wow, great.
Yeah.
That, I should say, that show was also an important show for Bob Dylan. He hadn't performed in a while, and he, gave just an extraordinary, electric, actually, performance there.
Fantastic. Yeah. This is Phil Oakes, and I chose this image because I like that he's got the Johnson administration behind him.
Yeah, that's great.
He was at odds. He was the most vocal of all. I think the most vocal of all of the political songwriters.
Oh, yeah, I think I agree with you.
And tortured soul, and really took a beating at a mental beating at the Democratic National Convention of 1968.
You write a little bit about a rift between him and Dylan. Dylan was a little bit of an antagonist, right?
Everyone I interviewed told me that there was quite it's a type of rivalry. Some people like David Frick over at Rolling Stone told me he thought that, well, maybe it's because he felt that maybe Dylan felt that Oakes had the goods, and that he wanted to. But there was a more vocal rivalry between those two than any of the others.
Yeah,
and most people I interviewed, like Eric Anderson, said, "Oh, there was no rivalry between us. We were all friends." But the more you research, there was a strong the painful part is that Oakes adored Dylan.
Yeah, well, I was about to say that. Yes.
He adored
Dylan
him.
almost like used that, like yeah, I mean, it was a complicated psychological set of issues there.
Do you think that rivalry though brought out the best in them, or do you think it had a damaging effect maybe on Oakes?
Maybe both. Maybe both.
I think a damaging effect certainly on Oakes.
Definitely.
I don't think it affected Dylan much one way or the other. But,
exactly. You're absolutely right. That's why I agree with you. I agree.
Yeah.
But Oakes, I think, was it was one more thorn in his side was that discomfort between them, I think,
Yeah, because he really looked up to Dylan.
Oh yeah, that comes across in the book for sure.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
How about this image?
I like that David. Now these are all by David Garr, who I met in the '90s when he photographed me when I was signed to Universal Records. I was making an album for MCA, and they said, "Who would you like to photograph you?" And I said, "Well, I love David Garr's work," so I worked with him, and he showed me all these images in his house. By the way, I just wanted to preface that. And I just always loved this image of the Lovin' Spoonful with the graffiti on the wall behind them, and this bizarre kind of action and energy, because they were, a rock band. And I think he captured that in this image. Like
playful, mischievous, yeah.
Yes, and a lot of action, and on the street, not quite as austere as some of the folk singers would have been photographed. So I love the Lovin' Spoonful. They were
something like Beatlesque about that.
Yes, I was gonna say. I was just gonna
Exactly.
say they were like they said the Village Mop Tops. They were like the Beatles of the village.
That's great.
Very true.
I like this. It's so random. This was this hayride, which I didn't know about. I found the image in David Garr's collection, but as the folk revival got so popular, there was this parade, this folk parade. A Cavalcade magazine here is presenting this folk parade, and Carolyn Hester, the beautiful Carolyn Hester, who was a role model for the folk singers of that era. She was like the archetype. Is riding this hayride. I just think it's so cool on the streets of the village.
It's great. It's almost surreal.
Yes.
Well,
I love it.
There was a kind of, here they are, in this incredibly urban area, sort of evoking rural history, and
It could be a Pasolini film.
I know, it is very Pasolini. Yeah, it's so funny. I love it though.
I do too.
I did this. This is a photo that I took on my iPhone, actually. And
beautiful.
it was late one night, and while I was writing the book, I would go out for walks at maybe 2 or 3 or 4 a.m. I hate to say, I was up all night writing. I couldn't stop. The research, once I would start reading and finding stuff, I just couldn't stop. And
Rabbit hole.
I would go. It was a fabulous rabbit hole. But what happened, I would go to walk outside, not for a break, but also just to feel like, could this have been real? Did this really happen? And I'd walk in McDougal Street, and I walked by Washington Square late one night. This isn't like the 4 a.m. I can tell there are a few people around, so actually this was a little earlier in the evening. But the lighting just looked so dramatic, and I shot that image on my phone.
Of course, it's Washington Square Park. Right?
It's Washington Square Park. That's the arch that was, of course, famously in the timeline of the book. This was climbed by Marcel Duchamp, and his friends drunkenly one night, and they got to the top, as I said, drunk, and proclaimed the village a free and independent, republic.
Richard's book, for those of you who haven't read it yet, he goes back several hundred years, honestly, to give you preface, and it's really kind of breathtaking how you open the book.
Thank you. I try to do that in a nutshell because I started writing that as a chapter, and it was just overwhelming for the reader, for including myself as a reader. Yeah. So I made it into a timeline so you could actually see 1600s and the 1700s and kind of
very nice historical context without burying, the history that I think most people are actually interested in.
Yes. You do it effectively, yes.
Yes, completely.
Thank you. It took a while. It took a while to get that honed down to that timeline. Yeah. But I love it. I use it in my class, a lot with the students.
So thank you for the slideshow. Thank you for narrating that. How did JFK's assassination in 1963 change things for the folk music scene in Greenwich Village? You write a bit about that.
I think very strongly. I think profoundly. I think Phil Oakes. I think a lot of these they looked up to him as like a, he was the youngest president. He was like a big brother. He spoke to young people, even in his inauguration speech. Like when he said, the torch is passed, just those words, the torch has passed. He's meaning that's for us, the young people. I mean, and then within a couple of years, he's, murdered and assassinated. I think that was devastating. I really think it was devastating. It affected the songwriting. Dylan still writes about it. Last year, didn't he have the A Murder Most Foul? I mean, how many 60-something years later or so he's writing about it?
So many of these are Lou Reed wrote a song.
Yes.
He was
Phil
a
Oakes
friend of mine, and the Birds, and
yes.
Phil Oakes, Abraham Martin and John, I mean, all of these songs, it had a kind of very, very important cultural resonance, beyond its political power, because it's very interesting if you think, there's been so much, kind of reinterpretation of the Kennedys, certainly, and, and John Kennedy's politics and whatnot. But at that time, young people saw him as, it was like, well, there was, Dwight Eisenhower, who was, of course, a World War II hero, but when an old man, in
a general,
yeah, and a military figure. Whereas, like, here comes, this young guy, and in a way that Kennedy, I don't think, ever could have realized, his statement, like, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, became a call to arms for young people, and became a kind of call to protest.
That's right.
I don't think the way that he ever really necessarily intended it or could have foreseen, but I think that's the way it was heard, and more importantly, even felt.
And then he created the Peace Corps almost immediately upon taking office. He started the Peace Corps, which was very appealing to young people at that time. The opposite of the War Corps. It was the Peace Corps.
And something else, as we're speaking about all of this, you said something earlier, Anthony, about how so much of the folk music in the '60s was really anti-fascist more than anything. And I wanted to reference Woody Guthrie and his slogan, "This machine kills fascists," and of course it's the guitar, right? And we're going to start taking questions shortly for Anthony and Richard. I just want to give our viewers a heads up if you want to start preparing them and sending them in. But while we wait, I have a few more questions I'd like to get through. Woodstock in 1969, and then the film about it, which was released a year later in 1970, made the counterculture mainstream. I think it's fair to say that. Is this the moment the folk music scene in the Village ended? Is this why? Can we make that diagnostic?
Richard, why don't you go ahead?
Well, let me first say one thing. When you say counterculture, one thing I always think of the words of Jonas Mekas, one of my mentors personally, and also a good dear friend of the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed. And he would say, "We're not the counterculture, we're the culture."
Culture.
You know what I mean? Okay, so with that said, it went, to me, I feel that from the point of view of the entertainment industry, especially, from the point of view of record labels and the film company that had the big success with the film, as you just said, it made this what maybe was a type of alternative music at one point. It did make it something that was now mainstream. Here's an example: Richie Havens, who had still been playing in the Village clubs.
Yeah.
Up
he
until
was for everybody. I saw Richie Havens 1,000 times. He was so great, but he opened for like Jimi Hendrix.
And he got him the gig. He got Hendrix. He actually helped get gigs for Hendrix too, because he told him you could get a gig at the Cafe Wa and these places. They'll hire you. He was very helpful in getting Hendrix started. But then he opened the Woodstock Festival, and he was an overnight sensation. I think the next night he was on the Tonight Show that would have been with the Johnny Carson at that point, right? The Tonight Show. So it's like, what a leap from these small clubs with 50 people and they're passing a hat to 500,000 people, and you're on the Tonight Show the next night.
And back then, when you appeared on something like the Tonight Show, the next day you were a star. You were
Right,
celebrity
yeah.
overnight.
It's
Yeah,
like
with that
like
kind of
SNL, Tonight Show, etc. SNL did not exist yet, so yes, Tonight Show.
Yeah, I mean, Woodstock clearly, had a huge impact. But, things were happening before that. The Beatles arriving,
yes.
was,
Absolutely.
where rock and roll became, I mean, look, the early rock and roll is peerless. I mean, I don't mean to in any way put it down, but, like the Beatles made it respectable for adults to like rock and roll, you
Mhm.
know? And then, like here come the Rolling Stones and all these other interesting groups, and suddenly the I remember talking about Bob Dylan to Mick Jagger one time, and Jagger was saying like, because I think Bob was just thinking like, here I am writing these. Why am I writing demos
Hmm.
for these people who are
Right.
having like huge hits with my songs, And so Dylan goes electric, and then suddenly
Right.
everybody goes electric, and
Mhm.
so what constitutes folk music at that point? Becomes a more complicated question,
Sure.
it there it still was, you still have, these beautiful albums by like Phil Oakes, like Pleasures of the Harbor, but is that a folk record?
Right.
You
It's like
know,
art rock. It's like art rock or
yes,
something.
Wow.
exactly.
Interesting.
Perfectly put. Yeah. Um, so there was a lot of changes, and then by the time Woodstock came along, everybody became aware of what the audience for this music had become and how big it was.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know what?
Yeah.
It's just one thing. I know you have questions, but one thing I was really pleasantly surprised in a way to hear when I interviewed people. I thought the folk scene hated the Beatles. I always imagined that, because the media separates the genres so much and whatever. I had this feeling that, oh, they must have been looked at like that. They were like, who are those, pop kids, whatever. But, everyone I spoke to, they were like, oh, we were glued to the screen when they were like on the Ed Sullivan Show. And John Sebastian described a scene where he's on a couch with Mama Cass and Zal from Zal, who would soon be a Love and Spoonful member himself. And they were just entranced by how the Beatles, like how they played.
Hmm.
And wow, we can do something like that. It was another fire
Yeah.
that was
Another
a fire upon a fire.
And you touch upon this in your book as well, Richard, very very beautifully. Here's some of the questions. So there was a
Oh,
fascinating documentary on Karen Dalton, which was released in 2020. In my own time, I had never really heard of her before seeing this film, which was fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about her?
would you like me to? Or would you like Anthony to?
Oh, Richard, I'd prefer if you did. I mean, I'm not
Okay.
a big Karen Dalton expert.
I also did not know that much about her, even though I knew her name. But she came to the scene early. She was in the early Village scene at the same time that Bob Dylan first moved here, so 60, 61-ish. And she was performing at the Cafe Watt in the daytime shows with Fred Neil and playing harmonica. Dylan would play harmonica for her also. She had a great voice, and everyone loved her. Peter Stanfill of the Holy Modal Rounders told me that she was the only really authentic folk singer of all of that young generation, with a fantastic scorched earth voice.
Mm.
Like there was almost like a folk version of Billie Holiday.
Wow.
But she had a strange sense of timing, because before the scene really took off, she hitchhiked to Colorado,
Oh.
and she came back to the Village in like '68 as it was kind of winding down.
Boy.
So
Wow.
she kind of missed. That's why we don't know her. But she was very brilliant and made a couple of really great albums, especially her interpretations of Tim Hardin songs and Fred Neil songs. They're beautiful. They're maybe the definitive versions for me.
Wow. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Here's another question. Can you talk a bit about the record stores that were in Greenwich Village during the time period discussed in Richard's book and how they were a part of the scene?
I certainly can.
Yeah. Good.
There was one right on Bleecker Street. Well, Bleecker Bob's eventually, but like I remember, it was incredible. I was a rock and roll kid. I mean, the folk. I knew who Bob Dylan was. And all of that. But I was really young and wasn't. I was responding to hearing the Beatles on the radio and seeing them on TV,
Me too.
and the stores in the Village. I mean, now people are, I mean, my students, I talk to them, about how much they should appreciate being able to get to all the music that they can get to online, because man, back then, I feel so lucky to have been in the Village because if I heard something, I might actually be able to find it,
Sure.
in those record stores. They were really cool, and the rock and roll ones were really cool. Like, you'd go in there and like I remember staring at the first album by The Who and just all of these things. And it was, they had everything. They had the stuff from England. They would play some of it, if you asked nicely. And so it was amazing. And then there were all the great, there were great record stores on 8th Street also. I mean, they were a little bit older, a little bit more expensive, I should say also. But very well stocked. And so you really had an opportunity to I mean, I remember when the first Traffic album came out. I think it was 1968. I remember just going to a record store, and of course, like the day it came out, they had it and
Yeah.
got it.
It was an event, right? And
These were it was the music was right there for you in a way that I think in many places it was. When I talk to people who grew up in other places and their struggles to get to
Oh.
music were incredible.
I had that in Florida. It was really hard to get
Florida.
certain records.
Sure.
But you know what? Can I add one thing about that? About the stores? That was part of also the infrastructure of how musicians could be in touch because you could meet at the record stores and the guitar stores and the folklore center earlier on. These places because there were no cell phones, and if you wanted to connect with musicians, to start a band or to get someone to play on your music or to do shows with, the record stores and music stores were the place to. That was like the cell phone. That was the
Sure. It was
the chat room.
the center, the heart center.
Yeah.
I have a few, just two more questions. You end the book, Richard, with a trip in the fall of 2021 down Waverly Place and into Washington Square Park to play music with people joining in, and you revisit the history of the Village, its art, its music, its revolutions, and you write, "Time stood still and not a second had passed." Is that spirit of the 60s still alive?
That was when I wrote that line, that was looking at a person, Happy Traum, who had been at the actual Beatnik riot and who I handed him my guitar to play it. And it just felt like such a timeless moment. That's what I meant by that. Like Anthony said, the prices in Greenwich Village are so different than what they were then as to what they are now. My neighbors in my building pay upward for 1 or 2 bedroom upward of $10,000 a month.
Sure.
And it used to be like Dylan paid $60 for his apartment on West 4th Street. So it's impossible to, what is the phrase? You can't step in the same river twice because it just keeps moving. Well, the Village has kept moving. And so there's a lot of changes, but there are moments, there are places and there are moments that are timeless still in the Village, I think.
And how about looking into the future? Will we ever have as pronounced a moment and movement as we had in the 60s in Greenwich Village? Not just in New York per se, but is it going to occur somewhere else in the world? Can you prognosticate?
Do you want Anthony to answer that?
Well,
sure.
One thing I always think about with things like that is, the nature of those movements is their unpredictability.
Yeah,
you're right. That's so true.
Things will happen. I mean, I retain the hope. It's things will be different. It will not repeat what was done. It shouldn't repeat what was done. But
it can't. It really can't be exactly the same.
Continue to evolve, and that's what the Village did.
I mean, the punk rock movement came out of the punk rock and that later the sort of the new wave, like when Suzanne Vega came, when Patti Smith earlier on in the 70s, she was opening for Phil Ochs. That sort of was the connecting the chain to the decades, and Suzanne Vega did that later. And Suzanne Vega will be also at the Museum of the City of New York with us next week on October 13th.
By the way, Richard, we have that in the chat. For those of you who are interested in learning more about this event that Richard was talking about for the Museum of the City of New York, it's in the comments section, so you can find the link there to learn more about it. But and that's next Thursday, you said, right?
Yes, the 13th of October. And tickets are on sale. They're selling out, so if you want to come, it's It's going
Get
to be
on
a
it.
very special evening, I think, and we've got some great
Sounds
guests: Carolyn Hester, David Amram, Suzanne Vega, Terry Roach of the Roaches,
Wow.
and some great speakers, and even Dolores Dixon, the first woman to sing "Blown in the Wind"
Oh,
at Folk City with the New World Singers,
fantastic.
who recorded the first to record it, I should say.
Great.
But yeah, I mean, when I was writing the book, if I could just add one thing to what Anthony
Sure.
was saying, I was listening to Eric Anderson's first album, and I was just imagining how it would have been where he, had this community to go visit Phil Oakes and watch TV with Phil Oakes and see Dylan at the Kettle of Fish, and they would talk about songwriting and kind of compare notes. All of that made their albums amazing to me. Like it was the community. It was a sense of community among musicians. I'm not sure how that exists in our modern world with the technology that we have, and it's just a different kind of communication.
Yes. Yep.
We don't just hang out at the Kettle of Fish playing new songs for each other.
But they are communicating.
Right. I know, and I do. I use that too.
Yeah.
So maybe things are still sort of spontaneously happening, just in a different space now, in a more virtual space.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
It could be.
So the book is Music and Revolution, Greenwich Village in the 1960s by Richard Barone, with an introduction by Anthony DeCurtis. Richard and Anthony, thank you so much for this educational and lively
Thank you for
and
doing
insightful discussion.
Thank you. What a
My
great
pleasure.
conversation. Thanks
My
for having
pleasure.
us.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in. Have a good, safe weekend.
Okay.
Bye,
Bye-bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.